So, welcome to this afternoon session, one of them. There's consecutive sessions happening at the same time. You've chosen this. We'll try not to disappoint you. We'll try not to make you think, oh, I wish I'd gone to that other one. Thank you very much. We've got our signers, I just want to say, Abdul, Rob, Sam, amazing team of signers, helping us think through in the most accessible way possible what it is that we're trying to do. And it's an overt symbol, isn't it, of the fact that we have crossed some frontiers around human rights to say that the dignity and respect that we have to accord each of us has to include being included as a starting point. And I'm not saying that we've achieved all of that as a society, but it's something that we have to be constantly mindful. What is it we are trying to do when we say we want people to have their human rights? We want to have our human rights. For those of you who were here yesterday, Helena Kennedy, the great civil rights lawyer, took us through the formation of those 30 rights, the declarations that were formed when Eleanor Roosevelt brought together all of those, many people from right around the world, to actually consider what are the basic rights that should be accorded to all of us. But of course, having them written down, and they are marvellous, doesn't actually equal having them. And we also know that even when you put things into law, it doesn't mean that societies practice those rights and give those rights or believe in those rights. And then we had a great discussion this morning led by Gary Young, which Peter was part of, which basically said that the frightening thing about rights is that not everybody thinks you ought to have them even when you've got them, and then they might fight quite hard to get them off you again. There isn't a theology in the world that gives women equal rights to men, not in terms of a scriptural idea. And the rights that the LGBTQ plus community fight for are, as Peter said this morning, forward and backwards in terms of agreeing with the rights and then the backlash to that agreement. And so it's a very perilous journey to take humanity forward to a place where we would say we're equal. We're equal not just in what we say to each other, but actually how that gets enacted. But obviously this festival called Ripples of Hope implies that we're not going to be activists unless we're hopeful that being an activist can make change. And we don't have to think that all that change is all on our individual shoulders. We can do it together and collectively. However, to do that, we also have to understand how my rights and my getting of my rights actually might be oppressive on somebody else's getting their rights. It isn't just as simple of, can I have my strawberry now, regardless of whether you got any fruit. And so I think these conversations that make us understand the intersectionality of injustices, and also, just Mandu and I were just talking about how we help each other unlearn things. We'd all like to shed all prejudices, but we've all been brought up in certain ways with different ideas and different cultures, and it's not that easy, is it? So we have to kind of come together and understand these things together and be helpful to each other. So we've got a great panel talking about human rights and the next frontiers. Last night, Elif Shafak gave the H.G. Wells lecture, and for those of you who were here, it was the Penn Centenary lecture. And for those of you who were here, she referred to the fact that H.G. Wells was, he left school when he was 14. He was a draper's assistant. He came from a very modest background, but he became a kind of polymath, and a good word in my opinion, understanding all kinds of things. And he was completely interested in both sci-fi and human rights, and could see how they came together, because this is an idea of what does the future look like? It doesn't always have to be spaceships. It could be equal rights. So we've got to discuss human rights and the next frontiers. We've got Gracie May Bradley, who's a policy expert, writer and campaigner, an expert in civil liberties, state racism and surveillance, and she's the interim director of Liberty. Maya Foy, sorry, I've just skipped you, Peter, for a second, leads a team of lawyers fighting against grave human rights abuses. She was selected as a World Economic Forum Young Global Leader in 2019 and named as one of Richard Branson's 65 most inspirational people in 2015. which I think is, not he didn't invite you to go to the moon with him yet, has he?
I'm waiting.
Let's
Maybe the top 10, right? No.
Peter Tatchell, as I said earlier, was tremendously inspiring this morning, I thought, and he's been campaigning for LGBTQ+ and human rights for 54 years, since 1967. He's one of my heroes, actually. He's engaged in 3,000 protests, has the scars to prove it, been arrested 100 times, and suffered over 300 violent assaults, mostly by homophobes and far-right extremists. He's currently director of the Peter Tatchell Foundation, which I encourage you all to go and look at and donate to. And then on my right, we have Mandu Reid. She became the first person of colour to lead a national political party in British history, which of course is the Women's Equality Party. And prior to that, she spent 12 years working at City Hall for all 3 mayors of London. At the very end of this streaming in, we're going to have one of our 30 poets. Simon Armitage, the Poet Laureate, invited 30 poets from around the world to write to one of the 30 declarations. And Sjon is going to be reading his poem and explaining why he wrote it, which we'll come to later on. But obviously, if you think about the frontier of human rights, we're even talking about whether robots should have rights. Where the possibilities for the future of human rights allows for a lot of sort of fertile thinking. And that can feel weird to talk about the rights of robots when we haven't actually solved the right for children to have safe care. Obviously, I'd like robots to have safe care, but they wouldn't be my absolute priority. However, I'd really like us to talk about whether let's start with you, Gracie. You are thinking at Liberty all the time about the rights that we've won, how to embed them more deeply, what the jeopardy is to those rights, but also, what are the future rights that we ought to be building in. I mean, this morning, one of our poets said that when she wrote to the right to have a family, and that a family created the normality of society is in the right. She said that would have been okay if the word of any sexuality had been in it, but it isn't. So what would you think personally and in your role at Liberty the next rights ought to be?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting question, and I have to say I haven't made it to robot rights yet. I mean, I think at Liberty we've really been at the coalface this year trying to ensure a human rights approach to the pandemic and answering the call, I think, that was made by BLM a couple of years ago, but that's been ringing out across the decades for racial equality. And I think that was most recently articulated, I think, as a demand for safety that didn't centre on policing, some kind of safety that involves resourcing communities and empowering communities well before those hard carceral edges of the state come in. So in a way, kind of for us, our work at the frontier is also very old work. It's about kind of those cleavages in society that have been really revealed by the pandemic and catalysed by the pandemic, but which aren't new. And it's about that struggle for, at the minute, racial equality, which, as I say, is very old work. But when you look at new technologies like facial recognition, predictive policing, algorithmic governance, you see that old logics are being kind of strengthened and catalysed by new technologies. So I think something that I'm always quite keen to say, because I've done quite a lot of work on kind of new technologies and surveillance technologies, is that sometimes there's a tendency to take the view from nowhere and look at something as if it's completely new, and say, oh, well, this is new. What's going to happen with it? What should we do about it? What might the rights issues be? And actually, I think it's really important to have a kind of critical material analysis so that we start from, well, who's already oppressed in society? What is the logic of the state already? And how are new technologies or, new working practices, whatever, how are they going to reinforce those logics? So actually, I think the struggle in some ways is the same as it has been for a very long time. And I think it's quite important that we don't lose that historical analysis. But I'll leave that there.
I think that's a great point, fantastic point, and probably the bedrock of the issue, which is that as society modernizes, you think that it's introducing new things, but you can actually just reinforce the prejudices that already exist, but you hardwire them in a different kind of way.
Yeah.
So we'll come back to that perhaps as some in more detailed examples. Peter, what would you say the new frontiers are? I know that you've fought many battles just to keep the ones we've already won going?
Well, thanks to Black Lives Matter and many others, we are now having a conversation about structural racism. But there's no equivalent conversation about structural misogyny, homophobia, ableism, and so on. So the conversation about the structural inequalities, the way in which the structure of society and institutions holds people back, denies them full opportunities, that is still a conversation that has to be had, and those are all human rights. But perhaps the biggest omission or the biggest issue overlooked is class. The fact that working class people are still shut out of so many opportunities because of low incomes and other forms of discrimination, whether it be in education or housing. And that begs the question of economic human rights. You know, we view human rights very much in terms of freedoms and civil liberties. But I would say, and of course the United Nations international covenants say, that economic rights are also human rights, and I think that's an issue we need to address. With the rise of the Green Movement, we now face the challenge of environmental human rights, the right to clean, safe air and water. The products we buy, infused with so many potentially cancer-causing chemicals. The question of making ecocide a crime against humanity and enforcing that. These are a new frontiers of human rights. Another issue, of course, is data. Data is the new frontier of human rights, or a new frontier. The way it's used, the way it's manipulated, the way in which it is abused to spy on us, to profile us, to influence people in power to do things to us. So we have the police, we have local councils using algorithms to determine who they target. Really scary stuff that is mostly completely below the radar. If you live in many council areas nowadays, they will use data to establish your risk of defaulting on your rent or council tax. They will use data to look at the chances of you trashing the home that's been provided for you, the council house that's been providing. All kinds of things that are slowly being used by the manipulation of data. We've had the big scandal with Pegasus, the secret spyware that has been used to spy on human rights defenders and activists all around the world, and of course many others. Until recently, completely unknown, completely below the radar, but potentially having huge harm and damage. Then, of course, there's the issue of genetic human rights. As the Human Genome Project is developed and more diseases can be identified with genetic predispositions, what is going to be the consequence of that for individuals who perhaps have a genetic predisposition to certain forms of cancer or heart disease or so on? We need protection against those people being penalized by insurance companies and so on. And then the final issue, which you've raised, which is one of my issues, is the challenge of artificial intelligence and human rights. What is going to be the impact of artificial intelligence on our rights as humans, and indeed, in return, what rights will artificial intelligence have? I can remember the 1970s when I went as a mature student to do a degree at North London Polytechnic. I wrote a paper on whether cyborgs, that is human-like robots, should have human rights. Could they have feelings? And I concluded that because they weren't made of organic matter, because they were purely mechanical, that they could mimic human feelings or express human feelings, but they wouldn't actually feel them in the same way that humans have. However, now with the enormous strides in artificial intelligence, I'm not so sure. And I think that in future there will be human-like robots that do things, and I think we'll have to think about whether they too have human rights. If any of you have seen the film Her, a great film that I would highly recommend, it poses lots of these challenges. It's through basically a love story, but you can see through that love story the challenges about the rights of the artificial intelligence that is at the center of this story. So I'll finish there.
Well, I don't know whether that's making you feel tired, the range of rights that we've got to add into our list of things to solve today. But it's that's exactly, I think, very, very important, both what you and Gracie have said, which is that on the one hand, we have in no way solved the rights to dignity and justice and equality for the communities of the world. And at the same time, there's all of these other dimensions which we have to attend to, genetic dimensions. And of course, the 30 rights don't talk about the right to the planet. They don't talk about the rights of animals. It is specifically human, and it implies that as long as we've solved our own rights, then that's kind of it. But I think we're opening out to a different sensibility now, aren't we? So, Mayo, what's your feeling about the frontiers and beyond?
Well, again, not yet with the robots, although there is a bit of an intersection with some of our work. I think, like the others have said, we are dealing with some really old fundamentals. I run Reprieve, which is a legal organisation, and you could view it as a defence organisation, a human rights organisation. A lot of what we do, I think, is looking at state abuse of power. And when they say you can judge society by looking at its prisons, you can also look at its death rows, and you can look at who the state at a certain point in time wants to target and kill or detain, or use their flex their muscles in the most violent way. And so right to life is, of course, there. And one of the things that I find so interesting is the way, I don't know whether it mirrors, I don't think it does, the state policy necessarily mirrors society's views on some of these people who are the targets, who are often the most hated, or whether it is a political agenda or a structural set of issues that ends up with a group of people who somehow it has become okay to hate those people. So those are the people for whom Reprieve does most of its work. So people on death rows around the world, that there's the adage, those without the capital get the punishment, to your point about economic rights. Yeah, right? Yeah. And it's disproportionately in the US, of course, people of colour who end up on death row. Why would that be? Is it because no, it's not about the crimes, it's about the structural inequality of the system. So I think at the sharp end of these justice systems, you see this, just denial of one of the most fundamental human rights. And I think one of the things that I'm thinking about a lot now as we move forward, of course, always, to Gracie's point about modernisation and looking at not just how this is a reincarnation of the same set of abuses. If you take, the use of drones to target and kill people who America and its allies have decided are enemies in, say, Pakistan or Yemen or Afghanistan, it is the same set of principles at play, power and violence, but the modernisation of the technique, the use of the drone, the idea that this is targeted, that it's clean, that it's precise, that it involves less blood. I'm really interested in this idea of sanitizing the violence because it does make it palatable. And if in the context of the death penalty, the lethal injection in the US, I've done a lot of work on method questions. Method of capital punishment shouldn't be the thing that determines whether a country or a state keeps that punishment on the statute books. But it is, and it has been. And the reason for that is that it actually is very, very primal. You have these states where they can only maintain support for the death penalty if they keep the lethal injection. Why? Because it's medicalized, because it's clinical.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not, it's the antithesis of medicine, and it's definitely torture, as are the other methods. But I'm fascinated by this idea that we want to modernize our state violence, and that in so doing it becomes more palatable also then to the public. So a lot of the work, I think, is around trying to unmask, and governments love secrecy, so pulling back the curtain on that and really looking behind and telling stories, of course. I think, for me, those are the sort of battlegrounds for rights right now, stopping us from just slipping into being comfortable with the abuse of power that we see because of the rhetoric around the people who are hated or the mechanism of
Okay,
killing.
so in other words, the sort of modernity that particularly goes with tech companies, that goes with tech generally, where tech apparently, because it doesn't have feelings and it's efficient, then you can kill people in a variety of manners and you can spy on them in a variety of ways and you can sort of redistribute the truth in various ways. But because you can't point a finger at a person, it somehow allows it to feel less
Human.
Yeah,
You know.
and as a result, it evades the idea of human rights almost.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mandu, what about your feeling of frontiers?
Frontiers. Well, I think I want to start by saying the frontiers really depend on what your vantage point is. If you're a woman in Ethiopia right now in the Tigray region, or a woman or girl in Afghanistan right now, the frontier for you is about resistance and some of the stuff I believe you will have talked about earlier today, grappling for the rights that were hard won or perhaps were nearly in your grasp. So, you know, a political entity like ours is always grappling on multiple fronts with the idea of, right, what are the rights that are in jeopardy, that are under threat, as well as what are the possibilities that we should be striving for when we zoom out and think big. And I want to echo some of what's already been said, because I firmly believe that you can't truly change the world if you don't change the system. And the system is responsible for determining what the norms are around rights. Now, this may seem like a really flippant example, but I was on the train up here today, coming up here today. I was half an hour delayed because there was a swan on the track. And it's funny, you mentioned animal rights, and the driver came on the tannoy and he said, we've got to stop the train because there's a swan and they're a protected species, so we had to just wait for the swan to move on. I'm happy for that swan. But it is just an example of how things that are baked into the system do determine the protections or the lack of protection that particular groups have. And I think we also need to, so if we can protect swans, I think we can do a better job of protecting women and girls, literally across the board. But just going back to a more serious point, I do think we have to embrace complexity. Look at the Human Rights Declaration. Wonderful. Fantastic. It's the centerpiece for everything we're discussing over these 2 days. But in a one-size-fits-man world, actually, it falls short if you don't address and zoom in on how not all human beings are dealing with the same set of circumstances. It wasn't until the Beijing Convention and sort of CEDAW was launched that a real kind of focus on what's going on for women and how women's lives are different came into being. And so if we're talking about the structures and the systems, frontiers that have been opened up that could accelerate progress towards equality between men and women since the COVID crisis hit are around reimagining our economy, valuing things like care, which we know were the backbone, right, of what kept us going through the crisis. And if you don't pay attention to those things, alongside all the stuff that's been mentioned around how tech is creating all sorts of new lines of inquiry for the human rights agenda, if you don't look at some of those other fundamentals, we're always going to be chasing our tail with this stuff. And so we need to look at how power manifests. We need to look at the ways power is used and abused, and we have to look at who are the beneficiaries and who are the victims of those, and that has to always be a frontier for us, whether you are in a society like this one, or whether you're grappling and fighting for survival in a place like Ethiopia or Afghanistan. You know, you deal with what's in front of you, but you've got to be looking ahead towards liberation. And liberation is only possible if the systems themselves, the institutions themselves, are on your to-do list for things that need to be sorted out and cleaned up and addressed.
Again, I don't know whether any of you were here when Hillary Clinton was in conversation on Wednesday night, virtually, but you know, she was the person who went to Beijing 25 years ago and said, actually, women's rights are human rights. It wasn't enshrined at all. So these frontiers where people go, you know, the fact that the right to have a family implies that you will be heteronormative, is something which then has to get unlocked. Otherwise, those rights are exclusive rights.
And they get baked into the system.
Exactly,
And that's the
into
stuff
the
that needs
system's
to be
already there.
unraveled. Yeah.
So, one of the things that, from everything that you've said, all of you are basically saying, look, we've got systemic injustice, running through thousands of years of our societies.
Yeah.
And then we have the global north and the global south, and we have white entitlement, and we have layers and layers and layers of things which, even if you put new rights sort of on top, as it were, you're still going to be banging into the same injustices as they go further down. So you pick up something like privacy, and you say we need justice around privacy. Well, I hear plenty of people saying, well, I've nothing to hide, and never expect to be racially profiled, aren't expecting to have anything, all right, they might not be committing, corporate fraud either, but they don't imagine themselves as ever being a victim of the state until it happens to them. And so they are gung-ho for almost like giving away privacy, I suppose you could say, because they're not going to be in jeopardy. So when you're discussing, Gracie, things like digital change with companies and parliamentarians and lobbyists, etc., how much do they want to acknowledge the issue of basic injustices that already exist and haven't been solved? How much do they want, if you like, almost like the new toys of rights to be discussed without getting down to the fundamentals?
I mean, a lot of the time, it's not on their radar at all. And I mean, when I talk about, it's not just parliamentarians and policymakers. When I started doing work on tech and surveillance about 5 years ago, if you talked about, in England in particular, if you talked about racial justice and facial recognition, people would be saying, well, why are you talking about that? This is a privacy thing. This is about our relationship to the state. It's about the state being able to see everybody all the time, which of course it is. There is always that everyman or every person issue, but people couldn't understand how racial justice came into that conversation, for example. So I think it's not just parliamentarians and policymakers, it's also the rights space itself needs to catch up, because rights is one framework for justice, right? It's not the only framework for justice.
Yeah.
And there are lots of people who have been using different languages and different organising tools that centre them for a very, very long time. Rights advocacy has often been, as done by NGOs, has been relatively legalistic, and it's been concerned with the state. So I think it's really important actually for rights groups to be listening to those other struggles. And when I say rights groups, I mean the kind of traditional NGOs as I would understand Liberty to be. We need to be listening to those other groups and those other struggles for justice, because then you can have a completely different conversation. So I've done a lot of work on government use of data for immigration enforcement purposes. Because under the hostile environment, essentially a lot of secret data sharing schemes were set up between central government departments and the Home Office. And it meant that if, for example, a teacher did the school census and registered a child's details, and then they ended up at the Department for Education, that data might be used for immigration enforcement purposes. The child, the parents wouldn't know, but also the teacher wouldn't know. So there's this really insidious data sharing going on. And when it came to doing advocacy around the Data Protection Bill 2017, it was really, really interesting, because a lot of people were saying, well, don't talk about the fact that this is going to make it difficult for children to go to school or scare people out of going to a doctor. Parliamentarians are only going to be interested in a kind of access to justice angle where this has an impact on people's ability to get their own records out of the Home Office. That was the political judgment that lots of people made, that it's only an access to justice point that is going to reach parliamentarians. Why would you talk about the material day-to-day impact that this kind of data sharing is going to have on people? And it's been a real battle to get people to understand, well, no, we should start with where people live their lives and what people need to live flourishing lives. And then we will bring the argument. We won't start with what can we get past the horses in the corridors of power and then work backwards, because what's the point? So yeah, it has been an upward battle, and I think I often look at the conversation in the US around new technologies. And I think it's a lot more nuanced. There's a far more advanced kind of equality analysis there. But I also think that's because progressive infrastructure there is quite different. There's a lot of different funding. There are lots of different groups. There are people like Con Mi Gente, who are an immigrant rights organisation that are leading this huge fight against Palantir and saying no tech for immigration enforcement. So England, the UK has got some catching up to do.
So we don't, I mean, it's interesting bearing in mind that, Peter was talking about there isn't something which systemically looks at many of these issues. And you're just talking about almost like a systemic progressive element that's beginning to emerge in the US or already is in there. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely there. And I think we have to be really wary of just importing stuff from the US because there are things that work, it's not the same place. We're not in the same context. But I think there's a political analysis there that needs building here in our context. That yeah, we've got more to do.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very aware, having worked in this field, for years and starting the Wow Women's World Festivals and all the rest of it, that we've changed our ability to feel confident about political language a lot, I think. I mean, we did a Speak Truth to Power Day here on Wednesday with lots of schools. And, 12-year-olds can talk about patriarchy, they can talk about structural racism, they can talk about the rights to clean air and the environment, and they discuss the planet. And I mean, this is a big step forward, I think, the ability for people to understand like how the cake is baked. I think that's quite new in our society and a relief, because once you can see the scaffolding, you can kind of go, well, that shouldn't be hanging on it for a start, and we want to redo it. But Peter, that idea of, an either or. So you're still dealing with so much to do with the LGBTQ plus communities, and obviously that's not integrated with the issue of economic justice. They're all related. But do you feel as if we have to build extra bandwidth into our thinking and activism in order to step into these next frontiers? You've talked about AI rights, possibly planetary rights, economic rights, and the fact that we haven't yet got a sort of systemic analysis of many of the other things. How much can we cope with, I suppose? That's a way to say it. What do we need in terms of activists to be able to deal with all of these extra additional elements?
Well, Mandu is absolutely right. We have so many existing challenges to deal with that we have failed so lamentably. So to take on all these new ones is an even extra burden and challenge. But it has to be done. We have to be ahead of the curve. We mustn't be reactive and defensive. We've got to be out there, setting the agenda before these things are too deeply embedded. Now, of course, many of them are already embedded, but, we need to call them out now rather than waiting for severe subsequent consequences. I think, the term intersectionality is a relatively new one, but the ideas of intersectionality were around in the 1960s.
Yeah, Kimberly Crenshaw.
I can remember in the Gay Liberation Front in London in the early 1970s, we were intersectional, recognising within our own community, people weren't just gay, they were black or disabled or elderly or whatever. And we also saw that our struggle for social justice was in parallel to the struggles of black people, Irish people, working class people, women, and so on. And the Gay Liberation Front participated in many protests alongside the women's liberation movement because we saw the intersection of homophobia and sexism, that straight male supremacism was a thing that impacted us both. So I think building those connections and recognizing that we can be stronger when we work together, that's also part of the way in which we can deal with existing and future challenges. If we can pool resources and provide solidarity with each other, we will be more effective and have greater impact.
Mm-hmm. And when you're doing your work, Mayor, and Reprieve, looking at the way that different regimes come in and out of focus in terms of cruelty, barbarity, oppressiveness, etc., the return of the Taliban, and so on, do you feel as if we need new NGOs in order to be able to build in these extra dimensions for our thinking? I mean, that is happening anyway. Or does an organisation like Reprieve build bigger frameworks for its thinking?
I think, as I had a conversation with a former colleague yesterday, trying to get her back to do a maternity cover, and I was selling the role to her really, and I was saying, if you come, and she's gone in to be a barrister, which is a very, there probably are some in this audience, but it's sort of, you're self-employed and you're working on your own and in a very lawyery, of course, context. And I was saying, you might want to do that, but I have seen you work within teams and you were amazing. She'd set up Middle East and North Africa, a lot of the strategy on the death penalty. And I was saying, if you just do it for this amount of time, you will learn all these things, the things that aren't, how the sausage is made, like the stuff that's not necessarily the most glamorous aspects of it, but you'll learn. And it's, to me, that's amazing, because then you know how to achieve impact in another organisation. She said to me, what, so you think I've come for a year, I'll learn all your trade secrets, and I'll go off and set up my own NGO? I said, yes, please do that. I think really good, not NGO doesn't have to be the model but I think the third sector as a sector, and people have different words for it. I think the word charity, charity is not helpful.
No.
Having really, really good organisations that have a mission, there is enough to do, as we know, but that operate in a way that is, democratic, human, thoughtful, creative, open, not a kind of industrial complex of NGOs. I think there's risks in that area, but that is financially sustainable. I think one of the problems we have in our sector is just the insecurity of financial infrastructure, which is a bit different in the US. Again, I agree with Gracie that there we see different models popping up. I think that's amazing. So sort of, being able to combine the different tools that we have to go at these issues is huge, and it's a wonderful to be able to work in a place where you want to work on this issue and you will have an impact. It's not magical thinking. That's the other thing about NGOs. I think you can look at big problems and not know how to. We can all do our bit, and we can have these conversations. If you're able to be in an organisation that's dedicated to achieving a certain thing, and if you're good at your jobs and you have a secure infrastructure and you have good people and a sensible strategy, you will do it. You will have done some of those things. So I can tell you the progress that's made on the death penalty in this country and how many lives. Not that it all has to be quantifiable, but I know what the objectives are. We were just talking before you came in about how long people stay in different roles and why you would stay in a role. It's because you want to achieve something. So, Grace said, I'm going to stay at this point. I said, well, what do you want to achieve? Because she knows she can. And so I don't know, I have no view on how many NGOs there should be or how we do, but that it should be a healthy, these organisations need to be healthy, and the way we work needs to sort of reflect our values. That's not a trite thing, that's huge, because we have not always been that way. And I think the NGO world and lawyers, and there's been a lot of a sort of imperialistic way of being, which is bad. And I mean, there may be net gain to some of it, but it's not the way I would want us to move forward. And I don't think we have to.
Yeah, so a new frontier for human rights actually could just be the way we also operate internally with our own organisations. But the idea that you kind of, to achieve something, you need to set your mind on the focus and get there, without being distracted by thousands of things, that's true. At the same time, I think you'll know this. Once you say you're the Women's Equality Party, then, well, that's also about men, really, isn't it? And, and that's about society, and that's about economics, and that's about everything. Yeah. So when you hear about the new frontiers, or you start thinking about the new frontiers, you can't really afford not to include them, can you? I mean, there are new rights issues all the time, which have to be taken into the idea of what the Women's Equality Party stands for. Or do you think that's too big an agenda? Because I'm very aware that sometimes people say, you going for your rights is actually standing in the way of me getting my rights. And that's something that's quite a struggle sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, there are those tensions, and I think one of the things that would help the entire ecosystem of NGOs, or third sector was the term you used, is kind of getting, I think, a better and more sophisticated discipline around solidarity. And that, I think, the radical solidarity we require, given the challenges we're facing, on the near front, but also looking ahead into what's on the horizon, really do require us to have an acceptance of the fact that tensions will materialize, but work really hard at trying to navigate and work through those. So let's improve our ability to have sophisticated, productive dialogue. Let's not bunker down and go deeper into our kind of purity spirals that actually limit our ability to come together collectively to problem solve the issues that are in front of us right now and that are encroaching in the near horizon. And I also think that it's the world that we're operating in at the moment, where polarization and division and acrimony and animosity and enmity are the kind of real ingredients, makes it very, very hard to do that. I think people become quite protectionist, and actually the entire system of those of us who are trying to push for change need to check ourselves when we find ourselves going into protectionism and come out and zoom out and reach out and look for opportunities to work hard on the common ground. I also think the lens that we use to problem solve issues can also be like refined. If you think about the example you gave of prisoners on death row, you know, who are they? Oh, nasty criminals, okay? If we want to try and make sense of what dynamics result in them being in that position, why don't we change the question that we ask? And you'll see how powerful it is if you, instead of asking, what's wrong with you? If you ask, what happened to you? You will start to unpick what the causes and structural dynamics that we've all made reference to in different ways are. And I think it's from there that solutions would emerge. And so I really do, I'm obviously asking for a lot, because not only do we have to keep our eye on so many different issues that are, some are developing very fast, some are threatening us in the very near future, but we also have to, in order to stand a chance of doing the work that's possible on these frontiers, change the sort of the discipline and approach we take to examining the problems and working with people with whom we might actually not always see eye to eye or feel potentially competition with.
So, I mean, the whole point as well is of staying within stories and, you know, connecting with each other as humans so that we carry on caring rather than, you know, siloing and becoming competitive is a big point. Can we put the lights up on the audience, please? So, new frontiers, what's occurred to you as new frontiers, things that you think that we need to address but we're not doing it yet, or we've only just begun? There's a hand up here, yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. I just had to sort of ask the question, the dichotomy of sort of state-organised interventions, and where does that become torture or terrorism? And we're okay, all torture, terrorism, that's bad and stuff, but state-organised, that's okay, that's fine. And in the case of last week, a very prominent case of where an individual's human rights have been quite clearly revoked, and we're not even going to have a chance to look at her circumstances.
Which case?
Shamina Baker.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to take a few questions at the same time. So there's the whole issue of citizenship and where the state decides it's going to do things. You know, so that's like whose rights are there? If they're a democratically elected government, does that mean that includes all rights already? Any other thoughts, questions? They don't have to relate to each other.
Frontiers, but then very old problems. A lot of the work I have research is on reproductive technology and reproductive rights. Just wondered if you had any thoughts about kind of the way that new technologies interact in that sphere, and it's so kind of ripe for just re-bringing up old problems in a new way, and we do need to really think about the way we use those technologies and conceptualize them very carefully.
Yeah, and I see that the right to die has kind of re-emerged as a debating space again. Any other thoughts at this stage? No? Okay, well, let's take those two, which is, you know, what, Gracie, you were responding to that idea of like a state intervention, saying, well, we've decided that she's not going to have her citizenship, she's going to be revoked, we're going to kind of hand her back to Bangladesh or wherever or nowhere. And what rights do we have to to call out new decisions that the state is making.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think you're going to have some stuff to say on this as well. But I think, you know, that was an executive decision, right? So the question is, what are the checks and balances that are in place for scrutinising those decisions? And what's really alarming at the minute is that this executive is trying to shred them, right? So, you know, judicial review and the Human Rights Act are both under threat. Voter ID will stop people having their say at the ballot box. The policing bill is also, if it becomes law, going to create a lot more confrontation between police and protesters. And so then you get to the question of, well, okay, where can people speak out? Where can people be heard? I think the really important, I mean, we have a lot of conversations about this in Liberty. Is it right to protest? Is it freedom to protest? Should we talk about these things as rights at all? Because I think there's something, you know, rights are obviously things that you claim against the state. But we also should be clear that these things aren't gifts from the state. So yes, the state may say, well, if you protest in this way, then you're going to face X. It's not within the state's gift to tell us whether or not we can protest, right? That is a fundamental freedom. So for all that the government is coming for these things, actually, it's not within the government's gift to take quite a lot of them away. And I think it's really important to recognise the current war on accountability as something that is a response to people successfully holding the executive to account. So it's really easy to see it as kind of, this is all terrible and it's getting worse, whereas actually I think we should see it as, collectively, we have been powerful, these accountability mechanisms have worked, and that's precisely why the government would like to try and weaken them. I think basically every government since the Human Rights Act was passed has threatened to do something to the Human Rights Act because it's really, really inconvenient. It's inconvenient. Well, it is if what you want is to just be able to do whatever you want to whoever you want. If actually you're a government that wants to make sensible decisions within the interests of, you know, the people that you govern, the Human Rights Act is quite a useful tool for helping you to make those decisions or to check the bad decisions that you make. So we don't have to necessarily view it that nihilistically. I mean, when it comes to Shamima Begum, I think, you know, people like Nadine El Anani and others have written really comprehensively on how citizenship in the UK has basically always been a conditional status for racialized people. Yeah. So citizenship stripping is something that's been used massively. The powers have been on the statute books for a long time. The governments have used them more and more as they have become more and more hostile to migrants. So I think it's really, you know, there's stuff going through the courts right now, but really we have to look at the logic that underpinned that decision, which was basically to say, well, look, if she'd had two white British parents, they wouldn't have been able to do that to her. Yep. Because her status was conditional, they were able to do this. And so it's really about, I think, militating for full personhood and belonging for all of us who might be made conditional. Because yes, it was her this time, but citizenship, it's a shaky thing. So I think really, yeah, I would be going for that logic. Basically, you need like massive anti-racist mobilization. That's really how you deal with something like the Shamima Begum
Okay,
case.
very quickly, if that's right. Do you want to just pick that up? Sorry, only because I've got to bring Sjon in. So,
yeah, I will be quick. It's so big that issue. I'll say just a couple of things about that case. I agree on citizenship. It's huge, and anybody who's brown the British government could just strip your citizenship if they chose to, and then it would take however many years. She's stuck in a camp. So I've spent a lot of time in the camps in Syria with the people who are there. And if you read, and this does go to something that I wanted to flag, if you read, I don't know, you know, what your ideas are about the people who the media have dubbed ISIS brides, jihadi John, like ISIS cups, all of that language, terrible. The language of terrorism, terrible. All of these terms are meaningless. Radicalization, meaningless term. De-radicalization, meaningless. The moment we do that, we have othered and we have vilified. And the current government is really good at using the media as its henchman. So what we have is a young girl who was trafficked. She was 50. She shouldn't have to say this, by the way. She shouldn't have to feel like she has to. She told me she did the live which nobody wanted her to do, because she thought then the British public would actually hear that she really was sorry. My view at this point, it is not up to the British public to decide what should happen to Shameen Begum. There are 15 families there. 63% of the women who were there, that they were trafficked over, according to what we have analysed. Is the British government looking at that? The majority of people there are children. So not only are they stripped of citizenship, they are abandoned in conditions that are completely inhumane, with children growing up in these camps, being billed as the worst of the worst. And that's what we go back to. If we want to talk about rights, we have to question the narrative that says this is a bad person, this is a good person,
absolutely.
and ask the question, why? I have asked every single one of my clients there, and all the British nationals are in North East Syria, although they've all been stripped of their citizenship, questions about why. And the patterns of trafficking and the abuse and the things that are going on to kids, and yet we're stripping them. We are threatening family separation, and we have decided we're not going to give them any kind of due process. I mean, that to me, it's Guantanamo. We work on Guantanamo. It's Guantanamo again, but worse because the majority of the detainees are children.
Children, yeah. That's what I still can't get over, the fact that she was a child. I just thought she should have child rights, full stop.
Yeah.
But let's just move, before I bring Sin in, just very quickly, if we could, on the issue of the next frontier of reproductive rights. It seems that it's easier to talk about reproductive rights provided you're talking heteronormal, but if you're anyway talking about not, then suddenly the rights become very complicated for people. Would you say that's true?
Yeah, I think it's one of the most enduring battlegrounds of the evolution of feminism, and here we are in the 21st century, still in a situation where the stuff we thought we could shelve is still contested. I thought we could put that on the shelf. Access to free, legal, and safe abortions, all the way up to the Supreme Court, Wade and Roe. That should have been solid. But no, we're in a situation where it is being weaponized, and where technology plays into this is something to do with what Maya said around how it's not just this government, but many of the most sinister governments or power brokers are really, really, really good at creating narratives that allow us that in a way distract and allow us to allow some of these things to happen initially surreptitiously, and then before we know it, hang on a minute, the proliferation of these ideas is so intense and so strong that rights that we thought we held dear are, literally frittering away before our eyes. And so what we need to do in a way is re-weaponize technology in order to use it as a counterweight. How can we actually use it to create harmony and unity rather than divisiveness and division? And I think reproductive rights is a battleground where that strategy could well be deployed.
Yeah.
And obviously, as we go, I talked about complexity and sophistication. We do have to expand our narratives beyond heteronormative narratives, because the world has moved on, and there are groups who are being left out of the conversation when we fail to do that.
Yeah, and I mean, just to end on that particular thing before I bring in Sjon, which is that the reason I'm mentioning heteronormative as well is because reproductive rights isn't just about the right to choose, but also the right to have children and to produce those children using new technologies and new ways, and that's going to be a big question at the frontier of who's allowed to be a parent and how they make those choices. I don't know whether, Peter, you've got any thoughts on that?
Well, I just say that although lesbian and bi women are often challenged over their right to have children, no one seems to challenge the unquestioned right of straight people to have children, no matter how unsuitable they are, no matter how inappropriate they are. And I think just we need to stand for the principle that all children deserve a safe, loving home with responsible, caring parents. And it doesn't matter what their sexuality or gender identity is, doesn't matter what their race or economic status is, as long as it's love and care, that's all that matters.
Sjon, you've been very patient, and we're coming to you now to give one of the poetic declarations. Can you hear me?
Yep, I'm here.
Thank you for coming in from Iceland. And actually, I had the pleasure of hearing the poem last night. It was amazing. Could you talk a little bit about why you chose the article, what the article is and why you chose it?
Well, it certainly didn't require patience to be with you. It's been a very illuminating conversation.
Can you hear everybody? Yeah. Yeah, go on.
You can hear me?
Yeah.
Good. I chose Article 2, and the reason why I chose Article 2 is because how it follows Article 1, which is this famous declaration about our human species being born free and equal in dignity and rights. It's like a wonderful, wonderful 2 sentences. And then Article 2 goes directly into the practicalities of it. So compared with the lyrical idealism of the first, it is very practical and to the point of process. And maybe because it's so prosaic, I thought it would be a good challenge to bring it into a poem somehow. And the article deals with that everyone is entitled to all the rights and freedoms set forth in this declaration before listing all the differences that go into everyone. But the question of everyone is not that simple, and it is possibly there that the frontier is at all times. The frontier is always with the people whose inclusion is being questioned. So the question is, so the poem is about that questioning and the processes that people have to go through to claim their human rights.
Thank you.
Measuring the shadow. Should you fortify your citadel so heavily that the beetle known as blacksmith in certain barbaric languages of the north can't find a crack in it, a stranger will be born in your midst. Anonymous. On the day it showed up, the sky was clear, is all I can say. By then, they had already lost the seasons. It appeared in the market square, a mere dot on the pavestones left of the herb stalls. None of the women folk had been pregnant. The chemist's Athanor was still being rebuilt after the last explosion. A homunculus hadn't sprung from there. Nothing had pierced the glass stone. At first, it was mistaken for a pool of drying blood until it moved on its own accord. A shadow without a body, crawling with leisure at the speed of an evening star. It only got as far as the temple ruins before it was captured, arrested, and put under guard. After deliberation, they gave it the sundial test to see if it was of their species or not. Gathered in the amphitheater, young and old, inspected the alien blot in its center. From dawn to night, they saw it change shape, and then again the day after. Sun and moon worked their magic, teasing a body from its formlessness, showing a head where a head should be. And on an afternoon in the 3rd month, it grew arms and legs, though not perfect and somewhat skewed. Laughter was heard coming from the crowd. A joker shouted, "Uncle Carlos," and they all joined in with their own comparisons. By then, it had started to measure right against the shadows of humans, for that is what they call themselves. I must stop here. A voice comes from inside the house. Supper's ready. Where are you, little blacksmith? Thank you.
Thank you, Sjon. And that's very chilling, the idea that you seal up everything to stop strangeness and otherness coming in, and it comes in, and then it becomes you. And wouldn't that be great if we didn't have to shut so many borders and we were able to have no others, but we were all just, as Tony Harrison, the great poet, said, just us, that great northern voice, just us together. So thanks very much for giving the expertise that you've got, and also for the work that you do, because we did a kind of session with NGOs when we were forming this festival, and everybody was so tired. And they spent a lot of the time talking about self-care, and would they ever get any? So I don't. It's a round of applause really for actually doing the work that they do as well. So thank you.